Hello and welcome to another edition of Wise Knit. I'm Kate Atherley and I'm here to untangle some of knitting's knottiest technical conundrums. This time talking about the provisional cast on. Provisional cast ons, in fact, because there are multiple methods and I'm going to review 3 with you. The whole point of the provisional cast on is that what it gives you is stitches that you can knit from in the other direction. Here I've got 3 swatches, and in each case, the cast on edge, there's something funny going on. There's a crochet chain, there's stitches on a needle here on a holder effectively, and then I've just got this length of waste yarn. Each one of these, whether it's the crochet chain, the needle, or that waste yarn, has stitches that are waiting for me to knit from them. So I might need to knit in the opposite direction. In our most recent issue, Jenny Stamen has designed another brilliant pair of gloves for us, and she uses a provisional cast on in the gaps between the fingers. It's actually a very clever way of solving what can be a challenge for some people, which is making the gloves neat. I'm going to review 3 methods with you. Crochet, this one, and the waste yarn method, and I'm going to talk about how to work it and also how to undo it, which is an important step. For the crochet method, I need to crochet myself a chain. So I need a crochet hook and some waste yarn. Definitely a contrasting color, something about the same thickness as the yarn that you're knitting with, and something smooth, easy to undo. And we're going to crochet a chain. And what you want is you want 1 chain for every stitch that you need to cast on, and then a couple more for good measure. I'm just going to make a short chain here because we don't need a lot of stitches for my demo. And when you have the number of stitches that you need, finish up. And it's a very good idea to put a little knot in the end here, because that helps you distinguish the finishing end from the starting end. What you've got with your crochet chain here, rotate it slowly so you can see it. You've got the V's of your chain at the front. And then you've got the little, friend of mine described these to me once as, and I think I misheard her. I think she was saying the bumps at the back of the stitches, but I heard it as bums, and will forever now think of it. You have these loops at the back of the stitches, so think of them as the little bums at the back of your crochet chain. V's at the front, bums at the back. Not elegant, but you'll remember it. And what you do with this is you use this as a basis to create your stitches with a pick up and knit maneuver. I've got my working yarn. I like to always start that actually with a slip knot. It just helps me keep the new stitches stable. So I've got my knitting needle and my project yarn set up with a slip knot, and I'm going to do a pick up and knit in the bums of my crochet chain. And the reason it's a good idea to have a couple of extra is that I find the first and the last can sometimes be a little bit uneven. So if you're struggling to pick up in the first one there, what you'll do is you'll poke the needle under that bump, slip the slip knot onto the needle, and there's my pick up and knit. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. And just to be clear where I'm doing that pick up and knit, again, that's that bump at the back of the V. There's 5, 6, there. I've got a couple of extra chains hanging out on either end, but that's fine, not a problem. And there's the stitches I'm going to knit from, and there's my crochet chain. Ta-da! Another way of achieving exactly the same result is getting a knitting needle involved. So I'm still going to crochet a chain, but I'm going to crochet it over the needle. So I set up for my crochet chain, and this time what I do is lie my knitting needle on top of the yarn, and I grab the yarn and pull it through the chain. I'm still just making a crochet chain. Move the yarn under the needle, grab, pull it over, move it under, like so. And you do this until you have as many stitches as you need. Whoop. I feel a little clumsy doing this. I feel like I've got too many things to control at the same time. But there is an advantage. Right, when I've got the number of stitches that I need here, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I will crochet a few more loops here, finish it up, and then put that knot in it again to help me undo. What I have are the stitches I'm going to knit from. Now, this has a slight advantage to the other method. Well, we don't have to do a pick up and knit because I know that's not everybody's favorite sport. But the other thing here is that it's precise. When you're doing the pick up and knit in the crochet chain, you actually have to be quite careful to make sure you're getting the right strands, make sure you're getting the bum. If you don't get the right strand, it can be a little bit hard to undo. With this method where you crochet over the needle, the stitches are perfectly set up and this will absolutely always come undone. The strand that you caught on the knitting needle here actually is the bum strand. That doesn't sound elegant, but I hope you know what I mean. So your choice, they achieve the same thing. From here, what you can do is just attach your working yarn and start knitting. The next method uses Judy's Magic Cast On, which is a cast on method beloved by toe-up sock knitters, but has a bunch of different applications. We'll put a link to the article that explains it below this video, but it's actually a very super thing. What you do with Judy's Magic Cast On is you're casting on 2 sets of stitches. And the reason these are live on a needle is because that needle was part of the cast on. You can also use a stitch holder, which I actually recommend if you're going to be knitting a lot from the cast on edge. We need our yarn and we need 2 needles. I'm just using big DPNs here for demo purposes. And I'm going to set up. And quick note here, there's a number of different variations of Judy's Magic Cast On, and they've got to do with just how you wrap your yarn, whether it starts on the top or the bottom needle, whether you start with a slip knot or not. That actually doesn't matter too much in this circumstances. I tend to start out of habit with the stitch on the top there. And what you're doing with Judy's Magic Cast On, again, I'm moving quickly. If you know it, you'll be fine. If you don't, go to those other articles. They're super that we'll link to. But the key is that you are casting on stitches onto 2 needles. I'm going to count to make sure I have the same number. 2, 4, 6, 2, 4, 6. And what I can do is knit from these and slip those to a stitch holder or a secondary needle. And so you've got your working stitches on the top and you've got the stitches that will be your held stitches on the bottom. Very clever. The third method uses waste yarn to just catch the loops of the cast on edge. Contrasting color, very helpful, as with the crochet method. And again, roughly matching in thickness, and smooth is helpful as well. I'm going to get my needle and my working yarn, the blue here. I'll start my cast on with a slip knot. And what I have to do here is I have to put the yarn, the waste yarn, below or behind the working yarn, so it's underneath. What I'm going to do with the working yarn is I'm going to wrap it. I'm going to wrap it around the yarn first of all. So the working yarn again is in front of the waist. I'm going to take it down, bring it up, drape it over top of the needle. Again, now the working yarn needs to come to the front. Then I take it down, so I'm catching the waste yarn, and the working yarn goes over top of the needle. I'm leaving it a little bit loose so you can see the loops of the stitches. Pull that through. Under to loop around this, and then over top of the needle. I'm going to start pulling these a little bit snugger so you can see what it would look like with a more managed tension. You don't want these loops at the bottom to be sloppy. And you don't want the stitches on the needle to be too big. So what I'm doing here is I'm pulling the waste yarn through, which is why I cut it the length quite short. I wouldn't do this from 2 balls of yarn, because each time it allows me to confirm the position. You want the working yarn on top and there, so it sits on top of the waste yarn and then wraps around on top of the needle. So how many stitches have I got? I've got 2, 4, 6, 8. All right, super. That's what I need. And then when I'm done, make sure that you just drape over the needle, and when you're finished, leave the waste yarn at the back, because what you're going to do is turn around to knit the first stitch. And I've seen different suggestions about how to handle this. What I do, it's not very elegant necessarily, is I come and then I just twist these around each other. It's a bit like, again, for those people who've done Judy's Magic Cast On, it's a bit like that, the twist that you have to do to just stabilize that last stitch. So I twist those around each other so that I can start knitting. Ta-da! No matter which of the 3 methods you're using, and no matter which way you make the crochet chain, what you're doing is you're giving yourself an edge that is going to be available to knit from later. It's pretty obvious in the Judy's Magic Cast On version that your edge is just right there. Look, they're already on the needle. I didn't even bother putting these on a stitch holder. So that's pretty helpful, very straightforward. If you use the waste yarn version, again, those loops are already available to you. And so you can just slip a needle through those stitches and set yourself up. What I tend to do is when I'm returning the stitches to the needle from a provisional cast on, I will do 2 things. First of all, I will generally use a smaller needle than the project needle, just so it's a little bit easier to get into those stitches. And I will always pop them on the needle before I remove the waste yarn. I see instructions that will often say remove the waste yarn and return the stitches to the needle. That makes me nervous. Get the stitches on the needle. Another reason to use a narrower one as well, because then that way it fits. You can fit both the needle and that waste yarn is still there in those stitches. And then once you've counted them, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, yep, that's the number I cast on, then you can safely remove them. Now, quick note about these stitches. It's always a good idea, count them as I did. Something else you might need to do is check the stitch orientation to make sure, see if they're presented left leg forward or right leg forward. Honestly, it doesn't matter. You're the boss of your stitches. And if you look at those stitches and think, well, those are the wrong way around, You know how to fix those, right? You know how to make sure that your stitches are the right way around. You just reposition them. So as with picking up a drop stitch, the most important thing is that you get them on the needle. Making sure that they're the right way around is very much the secondary step. There we go. Perfect. Let's talk about the last one, the crochet method here. The reason that we put a knot at the end of our crochet chain was so that we would know which direction to undo, because there's something sort of magical about the crochet chain method, that once you're undone, the closing up knot, you can, and I always feel like I have to hold my breath for this step, you can just unzip the chain to reveal the stitches at the edge. To work very carefully. What I'm going to do is I am going to catch those one by one on my needle as I unzip. This is why, by the way, this unzipping, we have to be careful. If I go right back to the crochet, the first of the crochet methods I showed you, when we're picking up in the bum of the stitches, what you pick up under that bum loop is important so that this unzips. That's what that's all about. So you see I'm unzipping here. My stitches are being returned to my needle. Now, there's a subtlety about this. I sort of glossed over it, but I want to go back and address it. This stitch on the edge is not pretty. It doesn't look quite as fully formed. These stitches look perfect. This one, this one, this one, this one. Gorgeous. But the one on the edge here is not quite right. I always worry a bit when I'm undoing that one because it seems a bit weird. And let me show you the one at the other end. It's got to do with the symmetry of a knit fabric. See, look, what's happening there? That's not even a full stitch. That's just kind of a twist of yarn. And pull the yarn out. Here's the waste yarn. What we've got here is an interesting side effect of the symmetry of a knit fabric. We're used to thinking of this little V as a knit stitch, right? You guys have figured this out already, right? You've observed this. If I turn it upside down, I have those same V's, right? Ooh, symmetrical up and down. But you're actually offset by half a stitch. If I grab my knitting needle and run it down the middle of this stitch here, what's happening is I'm landing between two stitches on the bottom edge. I'm offset by half a stitch. So what we're actually returning to our needles here is, see here, if I do it the other way around, look, perfect knit stitch. If I run down in the middle of that, there, and I turn this around, I'm between two stitches. Try it with a swatch that you've got with some fabric. You'll just see you're offset by half a stitch. So what we actually have here, instead of the 10 stitches that correspond, we've got 2 half stitches on the side. So we've got half a stitch and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 and another half a stitch. So we've got 10 loops on our needle, but the first and last can look a little bit wobbly. And depending on how you return the loops to the needles, and depending on your cast on method, the way you wrap the yarns around, the way you twisted them when you work that first join stitch in your working yarn, what can happen is you can end up being off by half a stitch, in that sometimes when I've picked up the edge and I'm sure I cast on 10, I can only find 9. Sometimes when I undo the edge and I cast on 10, I'm finding 11 in the lower edge. that's actually perfectly okay. The 11th might look like, I'll just show you what can happen is the 11th, it can look like this. It can sometimes be two sides of one stitch. You get sort of some, this is the technical term, some funniness at the edges. Ultimately, as long as they're just the edges, it doesn't matter. You need to focus on making sure that you have n-2 in the middle, where n was the number you cast on, like 10, so I should have 8 in the middle, and then what you'll end up with is some possible funniness at the edges. And if I need to make this the right stitch count, I might end up knitting 2 together, or I might have to do a cheeky increase that nobody will be aware of. So if you've been struggling with getting the right number of stitches, know that that's not you, that's just the interesting funkiness in the symmetry in the knit fabric. So you're always going to be offset by half a stitch, but not a problem. You can absolutely address it. So you see what we've got here is we've got a way of giving ourselves live stitches from the bottom of a piece of knitting. Back to why you might want to do this. Well, one more thing. One of the biggest questions I get when I'm teaching knitting, I teach a class about casting on and binding off, and people are always wondering about how to match them perfectly. There's a lovely chain bind off, nice and tidy. I like the look of that. It's very handsome. It's actually not that easy to make a good matched cast on. The crochet method, it's useful for more than just provisional. The crochet method looks like that. But when you're doing other types of binding off, like a ribbing bind off in pattern or something, there aren't that many cast-ons that match. So here's what we do. You do a provisional cast on, work your scarf, do your bind off, then return to here and bind these stitches off. So you get 2 perfectly matching edges. Not necessary with a sweater, for example, like your cast on and your bind off edges are so far apart that it's really not visible. But if you're doing a scarf where the 2 ends are hanging down, kind of center front, that's a nice, tidy, clever trick that you might wish to try. And with that, I hope this has been helpful. I hope I've demystified it a little bit for you. You've got a selection of methods. Use the one that makes the most sense for you. They're exactly the equivalent. Remember, the objective is just stitches you can knit from in the other direction. So whether you use the Judy's Magic Cast On, whether you use a crochet version, or whether you just use that wiggle around the waist yarn version, they're all good. Happy knitting!